Welcome back to Section 3. This last section will introduce the 11 RDTII pillars. Each pillar explanation is followed by an exercise question. The purpose of the exercises is to familiarize you with each pillar. This presentation does not explain the subpillars, however. To answer the questions related to the subpillars, you may need to go to the RDTII Guidelines document that has been shared to you together with MS Form. Please write your answers to the questions through the MS Form and submit the answers. Pillar 1 covers tariffs and trade defense measures applied to interregional imports of ICT goods. ICT products or goods are goods whose main purpose is to capture, transmit, process, and render information, and intermediate goods and inputs that are crucial to manufacture these goods. Examples include smartphones, computers, network equipment, storage media, semiconductors, electrical parts, electronics, sensors, processors, and cables. These measures are often designed to protect domestic firms, provide a source of government revenue, and prevent anti-competitive practices taken by foreign firms or foreign governments. However, the measures have the potential to limit the openness of the digital economy market. This, in turn, may deprive the economy of the first and even second-order benefits of digital trade. For example, tariff measures on electronics, telecommunication items, and high-performance computing technologies may end up reducing the economy's exposure to advanced digital products or technologies, and thereby deepening digital divides. Also, tariffs and trade measures on basic materials for battery and hardware and finished products such as computers, electronics, and telecommunication equipment affect the costs of digital trade. Pillar 1 covers the following subpillars. First, effectively applied tariffs on ICT-related goods imported from other Asia-Pacific economies. Second, coverage ratio of zero tariff lines on ICT goods from other Asia-Pacific economies. Third, status of being a signatory to the WTO Information Technology Agreement and its expansion, and fourth, anti-dumping, countervailing duties and safeguards on ICT-related goods imported by other Asia-Pacific economies. Weight rates of 35%, 35%, 15%, and 15% are given to the subpillars. The first two subpillars are given a greater weight equally than the last two subpillars. This is because the tariffs on ICT products reflect a comprehensive impact on costs of digital trade in ICT products, whereas the trade defense measures infrequently apply to the imports. Furthermore, the fact that an economy is not a member of the ITA 1 or 2 does not mean that its tariff rates are restrictive, as long as the economy does not impose tariffs on a number of ICT products. That's why the last subpillar was given a lesser weight. Here is the exercise question for the first pillar. Explain why the RDTII considers whether an economy is a member of ITA 1 and 2, which mandates elimination duties on ICT products, even though the RDTII already covers coverage ratio of zero tariff lines on ICT products. Pillar 2 covers restrictions on public procurement related to ICT goods and online services. This pillar follows the same definition of ICT goods as the first pillar. Some economies tend to favor domestic bidders in government procurement in order to protect the domestic market from potential foreign market power. Specifically, for procurement in sectors relevant to digital trade, such as IT technologies and infrastructure. The interests of national security and cybersecurity are involved as procuring entities carry sensitive information in the operation of public administration. However, the absence of foreign participation in procurement blocks potential avenues of digital trade. Accordingly, the regulating economy may not enjoy the first and second-order benefits of digital trade. Furthermore, while the national security and cybersecurity interests are significant, economies need to examine whether the measures are necessary to serve those interests or other less restrictive means exist. Pillar 2 covers discriminatory and trade-distortive public procurement measures policies, which are: first, exclusion of foreign firms from public procurement, including ICT goods and online services. Second, restrictions on source codes, encryption, and trade secrets. Third, other limitations on participation in procurement bidding, and fourth, being a signatory to the WTO Government Procurement Agreement known as WTO-GPA. Weights for each subpillar are 35%, 25%, 25%, and 15%, respectively. The first subpillar, exclusion of foreign firms from procurement, is given the greatest weight of 35%, because it discriminates against foreign firms and bans foreign participation in public procurement. The second and third subpillars, restrictions on trade secrets and other limitations on participating in procurement, are given a lesser weight of 25%, because, although it is trade distortive in that the requirements sometimes discourage or even block foreign or domestic firms from participating in procurement, it does not discriminate against foreign firms. The last subpillar, being a signatory to the WTO GPA, is given the least weight of 15%, because, while it is significant for digital trade by ensuring commitments of the most favored nation treatment and national treatment for procurement, not being a member of the treaty does not necessarily mean that the economy discriminates against foreign firms or distorts trade in procurement. Here is the exercise question for the second pillar. The following measures are restrictions on source codes, encryption, and trade secrets. Categorize the following measures into two groups. Which of the groups has the greater potential to restrict digital trade? First, Indonesia requires that providers of custom-made software must provide or escrow the source codes associated with their service. Second, the Republic of Korea requires that suppliers of certain software, network, and hardware equipment submit the source code of their products to pass the cryptographic module validation process. Third, the Philippines requires technology and knowledge transfer to the procuring entity for the provision of consulting services. Fourth, India prescribes certain modes or methods for encryption for e-government and e-commerce procurement. Fifth, the Republic of Korea requires suppliers of software, network, and hardware equipment that deals with non-confidential but important information to comply with the cryptographic module validation standards, encryption standards developed in the Republic of Korea, example, ARIA, SEED, LEA, and HEIT. Pillar 3 covers restrictions on foreign direct investment in sectors related to digital trade. These sectors include the manufacturing of telecommunication facilities, telecommunication services, computer services, and Internet services. This pillar covers foreign investment policies that may create a burden on foreign investors, despite protecting national security and domestic players. The interest of national security is involved in forming foreign investment policies, because the mentioned digital sectors are sensitive sectors as they relate to building critical infrastructure. Economies may not want to increase its dependence on foreign investors in these sectors. However, some of the foreign investment measures do not necessarily address these concerns, but end up restricting foreign investment. This stagnates competition for better ICT products, digital goods, online services, and digital trade infrastructure. In this regard, Pillar 3 deals with the following restrictions in sectors relevant to digital trade. First, maximum foreign equity shares. Second, joint venture requirement. Third, nationality or residency requirement for board of directors or managers, and fourth, screening of investment and acquisitions. The weights are 40%, 25%, 10%, and 25%, respectively. The greatest weight, 40%, is given to the first subpillar, since the numerical limitations on foreign ownership flatly discriminate against foreign investors and directly block foreign investment. The second subpillar, a joint venture requirement, is given the weight of 25% because, while it discourages foreign investment because of the concern for technology transfer, it does not block foreign investment as the maximum caps on ownership do. The fourth subpillar, screening of investment and acquisitions, is given the same weight of 25% since, while it discourages foreign investors due to the time and cost involved in the screening process, and less predictability and certainty, it does not block foreign ownership. The third subpillar, nationality or residency requirements for directors or managers, is given the least weight, 10%, since the degree to which these requirements discourage foreign investment is relatively limited. Here is the exercise question for the third pillar. The second subpillar covers joint venture requirements in sectors relevant to digital trade. Explain why it is restrictive to require a foreign firm to a joint venture with a domestic firm. Pillar 4 deals with intellectual property rights or IPR. In the context of RDTII, IPRs here concern patents, copyrights, and trade secrets. IPR play a crucial role in fostering innovation and creativity in digital trade. Generally, sound policies regarding IPRs find a proper balance between the interests of protecting individual rights to intellectual property and fostering the freedom to use upon the existing intellectual property. On the other hand, imbalance in IP policies tend to restrict digital trade because they contribute to an uncertain and unfavorable regulatory environment. The pillar comprises of the following subpillars. First, restrictions on application for local patents and on enforcement of foreign patents. Second, presence of copyright exceptions. Third, inadequate enforcement of copyright. Fourth, mandatory disclosure of trade secrets, such as source code and algorithms, and fifth, IPR environment based on Global Competitiveness Index. Each subpillar is given an equal weight rate of 20%. Here is the exercise question for the fourth pillar. The most common two copyright exceptions are the doctrine of fair use and the doctrine of fair dealing. Which one is more conducive to international digital trade, that is, favorable to foreign businesses venturing into a domestic market? Explain why. Pillar 5 deals with policies regarding telecommunications infrastructure and competition. The government implements regulation in telecommunication market in order to protect the policy objectives, such as national security, provision of critical infrastructure, raising government revenue, and effective allocation of scarce resources. However, for domestic telecom market to benefit from digital trade, these policy objectives need to be balanced with the openness of the market for foreign investment. This is because the openness induces competition among the domestic telecom providers and foreign telecom providers. Pillar 5 flags telecom policies and practices that undermine the openness and competition by covering: first, lack of liberalization of the telecommunications sector. Second, anti-competitive practices in the telecommunications sector and other restrictions, and third, strict licensing requirements. Each subpillar is given an equal weight. Exercise question for the fifth pillar. The first subpillar looks at the degree to which the telecommunication market is liberalized. This subpillar is designed to measure the openness for competition in the market. By your own terms, define the liberalization of a telecom market. Pillar 6 deals with cross-border data policies. The data policies prevent data from flowing in a laissez-faire manner. Sound cross-border data policies are often based on a subtle balancing of business cost, data privacy, and data protection, among other policy objectives. Regarding business cost, regulation on cross-border data flows tends to increase the cost of compliance as they set up barriers for businesses to store and process data. Transferring of data across borders is a crucial driver of digital trade, as data is integral for digital goods, online services, and even digital trade infrastructure. Therefore, barriers on the movement of data across borders could heighten the costs for digital trade. Data privacy refers to an individual's right to control over the way in which their personal data gets collected and used. Data protection refers to the responsibility of entities to apply safeguard mechanisms to the handling of data. The better protected data privacy is, and the stronger data protection exists, the greater digital trust the regulatory environment has in the eyes of businesses and consumers. Pillar 6 covers regulatory measures on cross-border data transfer that do not get justified in light of these policy parameters in terms of failing to find a proper balance of these objectives. The imbalance makes the measures trade distortive in that it either blocks or discourages businesses from engaging in digital trade in the respective regulatory environments. These regulatory measures tend to be more trade distortive when they apply to personal data rather than non-personal data. Personal data refers to any information that relates to an identified, or directly or indirectly identifiable individual, including sensitive data and pseudonymous that makes an individual identifiable with additional information. By contrast, non-personal data are anonymous data that do not relate to an identified or identifiable individual. The reason is that personal data carries greater value than non-personal data. Therefore, the cost on the transfer of personal data incurs against businesses is harder to justify than of non-personal data. Personal data is the basis of cross-border online services such as financial, business, and IT services. Also, personal data creates an opportunity for enterprises to better understanding the consumer's needs and to improve their consumer engagement. This pillar evaluates regulatory environment for cross-border data flows through three subpillars, which are: first, conditions of local storage, processing, or infrastructure. Second, conditions of consent, evaluation, or approval. Third, being a signatory to a regional-wide interoperability initiative, such as a PEC cross-border privacy rules system. The three sub-pillars are not equally restrictive. 70%, 20%, and 10% of weights are given to the sub-pillars, respectively. The first sub-pillar, conditions of local storage requirements, is regarded as more restrictive, because the conditions not only incur cost as businesses are required to store, process, or build an infrastructure for data within the economy in order to transfer them abroad, but also fail to promote data privacy and data protection, which increases digital trust. This is because the local storage does not address how data subjects data is to be actually used abroad. The second subpillar that deals with another set of conditions for cross-border data is less impactful because, while it incurs business costs, it ensures digital trust in regulatory environments where data are to be used. For example, the condition that data cannot be transferred unless the level of data protection in receiving economies is deemed adequate by the government tends to ensure that data gets some protection in the recipient economy. However, as the regulating economy has no or little control over data privacy and protection abroad, the effect of this one-time satisfaction of such a condition on forming digital trust is limited. The third subpillar gets the least weight because, although being a signatory to the APEC CBPR contributes to interoperability of data privacy regulation in the region, not all economies in the region are APEC members and eligible for this initiative. Subpillar 6.1 deals with conditions of local storage, processing, or infrastructure, as well as ban on data transfers restrict the movement of data. Local storage requirements mandate that a copy of certain data be stored within the economy. Businesses can transfer data across borders as long as a copy of the data is kept within the economy. Local processing requirements mandate that businesses process certain data domestically. Processing data refers to various activities involving data, such as storage, adaptation, use, disclosure, and dissemination. The local processing requirements are shown as more restrictive than the local storage requirements in this spectrum, because the definition of processing includes storage. So, a local processing requirement often presupposes a local storage requirement. Moreover, to process data locally, foreign companies often need to hire domestic service providers even though the companies may already have their own data processor, which constitutes additional costs. Infrastructure requirements mandate an establishment of a local data center as a condition to provide certain services using data. This requirement is shown as even more restrictive than local processing requirements in this spectrum, because the establishment of data centers or local servers increases the fixed costs and barriers for companies. Bans on data transfers prohibit cross-border transfer of data. This is considered as the most restrictive, and thus places itself at the right end of the spectrum. Subpillar 6.2 deals with another type of conditions on the cross-border movement of data. This means that, even if businesses and organizations satisfy the local storage or processing requirements, they do not get to transfer data unless they also satisfy the set of conditions that this subpillar deals with. These conditions prevent businesses and organizations from transferring data to economies where the level of data protection is not adequate or equivalent to the level of domestic data protection. However, the conditions vary, depending on which entity gets to decide whether a particular economy has that requisite level of data protection. As you can see in the figure, the decision-making could be reserved to no entity, individuals, businesses, or the government. First, no entity. There is no condition attached to cross-border data transfer, and thus no entity decides the question of the adequacy and equivalence of data protection in economies where data gets transferred. In this case, economies often allow data flows across borders freely, assuming that businesses and organizations that transfer the data are held accountable and liable for possible data breaches that take place in the destination economies. Second, individuals or data subjects. Here, the individuals decide whether to allow the transfer of their data to a particular economy by providing their consent. Third, businesses decide it by evaluating whether a particular economy to which data is about to be transferred has an adequate or equivalent level of data protection. Lastly, the government determines if certain economies have that requisite level of data protection. To determine which one of these conditions is more trade distortive than another is difficult. On the one hand, the lack of such a condition, the consent mechanism by individuals, and the mechanism for businesses and organizations' evaluation of the conditions seem to restrict the movement of data less than the mechanism for the government's approval. This is because the movement of data lies in autonomy of individuals, or because the decision-making is reserved to businesses and organizations rather than the government. On the other hand, individual users or even businesses may not be competent entities to determine which economy has an adequate or equivalent level of data protection. It is rather the government that is in a more appropriate position to determine that question, whether which economy has achieved digital trust. Accordingly, this subpillar differentiates the conditions, not based on types of decision-making entities, but based on types of data. If a condition concerns personal data, it is more restrictive than a condition that only concerns non-personal data. Here, question for the sixth pillar. The first subpillar deals with local storage, processing, and infrastructure. Categorize the following measures into one of the three types of conditions on cross-border data policies. First, Turkey requires system operators, payment institutions, and electronic money institutions to collect all relevant documents and records within the country. Second, Vietnam requires foreign providers of internet services and telecommunications to store in Vietnam personal data of their users. Third, Australia requires companies to both store and process health records, excluding personal information within Australia. Fourth, the Republic of Korea requires financial service providers that use cloud services to locally process credit and unique identification information of their users. Fifth, Indonesia requires foreign banks and payment networks to establish a local data center to process electronic transactions. Pillar 7 deals with policies governing the use of data in the regulating economy. This pillar looks at data policies in light of not only three policy parameters: business cost, data privacy, and data protection, but also cybersecurity. Cybersecurity refers to the government's enforcement efforts to protect organizations, individuals, and networks of both public and private sectors from digital attacks. Along with data privacy and data protection, cybersecurity has a significant impact on digital trust. The data policies that this pillar are considered as trade distortive not necessarily because, as in Pillar 6, these measures leave out any one of the four policy parameters, but rather because the measures are not balanced among these policy objectives. In this regard, This pillar considers the following as restrictive. First, the lack of comprehensive data protection legal framework. Second, data retention requirement. Third, requirement to conduct data protection impact assessment DPIA, or appoint a data protection officer DPO. Fourth, government access to personal data. The weights for each subpillar are 35%, 30%, 10%, and 25%. A comprehensive data protection legal framework that applies across all sectors is given the greatest weight because it promotes all the policy parameters: less cost, greater data privacy, data protection, and cybersecurity. It is conducive to digital trade in that it promotes digital trust among users by ensuring users' data privacy and appurtenant rights. Conversely, the fragmentation of data protection obligations increases regulatory burdens on businesses. The data retention requirements is given the second greatest weight because, although it increases compliance cost and undermines data privacy, it is just one cybersecurity mechanism, whereas a comprehensive data protection law contains a bundle of users' rights and data protection mechanisms, and as a result its impact is more prevalent. The requirement to conduct DPIA, or appoint a DPO, because this requirement negatively affects only one policy parameter, on cost of compliance, it still reinforces data privacy and data protection. The government's access to personal data is given a weight greater than the DPIA or DPO requirement because the government's access to such data for law enforcement purposes undercut digital trust of individual users. However, the government's access to personal data is not as impactful on digital trade as the data retention requirements. This is because, while it undermines digital trust as the data retention schemes do, the government access does not create obligation on businesses and additional burdens. Here is the exercise question for the seventh pillar. The second subpillar deals with data retention requirements. Which one of the following data retention requirements do you think deserves a higher score, more restrictive, in this subpillar? First, Australia requires a telecommunications service provider to keep specific telecommunications data relating to the services it offers for 2 years at least. The data include the subscriber and the accounts of telecommunications devices, the source of a communication, the destination of a communication, the date, time, and duration of a communication, the type of a communication, and the location of equipment or a line used. Second, the Republic of Korea requires data controllers to destroy personal information upon the fulfillment of the purpose of processing the information. Pillar 8 deals with measures governing intermediary liability and restrictions on content access. Internet intermediaries can be defined as the intermediaries that bring together or facilitate transactions between the third parties on the Internet by giving access, transmit, and index content, or provide Internet-based services to third parties. The intermediaries facilitate digital trade and are included Internet Service Providers (ISP) and Internet Content Providers (ICP). The regulation of Internet intermediaries is based on the interest of reducing illegal content over the Internet and holding perpetrators accountable. However, imposing onerous liability or obligations on the Internet intermediaries would likely discourage them from participating in digital trade in the regulating economy. Pillar 8 deals with regulatory measures that stand on an ill-placed balance of these two competing objectives, including: first, lack of safe harbor for intermediaries. Second, user identity or monitoring requirements. Third, blocking or filtering of web content. Fourth, licensing schemes and local/commercial presence requirements. An equal weight of 25% is given because each subpillar seems to be equally important restrictions for Internet intermediaries. Regarding the first subpillar, without the safe harbor provision in place, or with an unclear or limited scope, the intermediaries face a higher risk of being liable for their users' activities and result in bearing costs from litigation. The second subpillar on user identity and monitoring requirements impose upon the intermediaries additional responsibilities, and thus incurs costs of procuring additional software or hiring additional workforces to monitor online activities and collect their users' identities. In addition, to mitigate the liability arising from their users' activities, potentially due to the lack of safe harbor, and the existence monitoring requirements, the intermediaries may impose unnecessary blocking and filtering. Blocking or filtering, whether performed by the government or intermediaries, directly interrupt the intermediaries in performing their services and impact their users. The last subpillar on licensing schemes is burdensome and costly for Internet intermediaries, because they have to hire a local representative or establish infrastructure there to operate across borders. Exercise for the eighth pillar. The first subpillar deals with safe harbor provisions for Internet intermediaries. Economies that do not have any safe harbor provisions for the intermediaries receive a high score, restrictive. Explain why the lack of safe harbor provisions restricts digital trade, if they do. Pillar 9 captures quantitative trade restrictions, including all prohibitions or restrictions other than tariffs or taxes that limit the importation and exportation of ICT goods and online services. Some of the measures are in place based on the interests of protecting public order, cybersecurity, and national security. For example, there are import bans on applications to cut off cybersecurity, as well as national security threats to the domestic networks. Export bans prohibit exports of certain ICT products and technologies considered to be vital to the interests of the nations. Other measures are for the purpose of guarding the domestic market from potential foreign market power. For example, local content requirements imposed on imports push foreign suppliers to acquire domestic components. However, these policy objectives stand in tension with the interest of digital trade and economy integration. Pillar 9 aims to reveal specific areas of quantitative trade restrictions covering the following subpillars. First, imports bans. Second, other import restrictions. Third, local content requirement for the commercial market. Fourth, export restrictions. The weights of each subpillars are 40%, 25%, 25%, and 10%. The first subpillar on import ban is the most impactful on digital trade as it completely prohibits imports, thus receiving the highest weight of 40%. The second and third subpillars on other import restrictions and local content requirements receive a lesser weight of 25%, because these measures limit the flows of ICT goods and online services, and discriminate against foreign business. In particular, other import restrictions hinder trade facilitation by imposing additional import procedures. Local content requirements requiring foreign companies to use domestic resources according to the prescribed threshold. This increases costs and barriers for the companies to find suitable local materials or services to their supply chains. The last subpillar on export restrictions has a limited impact on foreign competition in the economy concerned. Therefore, the least weight is given. Exercise for the ninth pillar. The first subpillar deals with import, bans on ICT products and online services. Write one example of recent import bans imposed by any economy on ICT products or online services of foreign businesses. Pillar 10 covers technical standards that can function as a trade restriction for ICT goods and online services in the telecommunications sector in the digital economy. Technical standards ensure effectiveness of products and consumer safety by setting out minimum requirements necessary to ensure the quality of products or services. However, disparate technical standards across the region undermine this interoperability and thereby discourage digital trade due to higher trade costs and delayed process. Adopting technical standards that are internationally recognized as best practices increase the interoperability of products and services across the region. Pillar 10 measures the interoperability of regulation in the following subpillars. First, transparency of technical standards regime. Second, self-certification for product safety, such as EMC, EMI, and radio transmission. Third, product screening and testing requirements. Fourth, restrictions on encryption standards and trade secrets. An equal weight of 25% is given because each subpillar discourages foreign businesses from operating their businesses in certain economies and have the potential to be implemented specifically to discriminate against foreign businesses. Divergent domestic approaches on standards and compliance procedures of self-certification and testing requirements could result in inconsistent quality and safety of the end products or services in the market. Exercise for the 10th pillar. The third subpillar deals with an additional screening or testing requirement on ICT imports for the interest of national security. Which one of the following is the least restrictive towards digital trade? First, New Zealand requires companies that use a 5G network equipment to receive approval under security assessment by the Government Communications Security Bureau to prevent national security threats. Second, India requires in-country security testing on all telecom network equipment and products. Third, the Russian Federation requires equipment and devices containing encryption to be registered with the Federal Security Service, FSS, and the manufacturer or the seller to obtain FSS notification upon importation or exportation of such equipment. Notification of the FSS is a prerequisite for the import into the territory of the Eurasian Economic Union, EAEU, or export from the territory of the EAEU of equipment containing encryption elements. Fourth, Thailand requires telecommunication equipment to be tested to ensure that the products conform with the technical standard prescribed by the national agency. The agency recognizes both local and foreign testing laboratory results, which conform to the required conditions. The last pillar, Pillar 11, captures restrictions on online sales and transactions. The steady increase in online sales and transactions over the years in both developed and developing economies reflects how critical these flows have become for digital trade. Measures surrounding electronic commerce in the areas of online sales, delivery, advertising, online payment, and domain names limit the openness to digital trade, as these are essentials to set up and operate an e-commerce business in the regulating economy. Furthermore, lack of legal recognition for electronic signatures and transactions cuts back on not only openness, but also harmonization of regulation, and thus undermines interoperability of e-commerce businesses in the region. Finally, the presence of consumer protection law in the e-commerce sector increases consumer trust and participation in digital trade by foreign vendors in the regulating economy. Based on this understanding, Pillar 11 measures both openness and harmonization in the following subpillars. First, restrictions on online sales, delivery, and advertising. Second, restrictions on online payments. Third, low threshold for de minimis rule. Fourth, restrictions on domain name. Fifth, international legal framework for online purchases. The weights for each subpillar are 30%, 20%, 20%, 10%, and 20%. The first subpillar is given the greatest weight because restrictions on sales, or restrictions on delivery, or advertising set up direct barriers for vendors to engage in digital trade or reach consumers. The second subpillar, restrictions on online payments, is given a lesser weight as the restrictions do not necessarily block sales or promotion of goods, but make cross-border payments in electronic commerce cumbersome. The third subpillar is also given 20% because the lack of de minimis rule does not block flows of goods, but tends to increase the prices of imports. The last subpillar is also given the same weight, since the lack of consumer protection law that applies to electronic commerce undermines trust for consumers, and the lack of legal recognition of electronic signatures and transactions creates uncertainty for vendors. The fourth subpillar is given the least weight, because restrictions on domain names are not impactful, as the other restrictions. Exercise for the 11th pillar. The first subpillar deals restriction to online purchases, delivery of online purchases, and online advertising. Which one of the following measures do you think is the most restrictive towards trade in e-commerce? First, the Philippines bans foreign ownership of retail trade enterprises with paid-up capital of less than $2.5 million. Second, India provides that B2B e-commerce must not have more than one vendor that accounts for more than 25% of sales. Third, Pakistan prohibits the broadcast of advertisements produced in India or featuring Indian actors and characters. Thank you.